Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. Today we're going to talk about the subject of bribery, bribing, something that where you are from may not be so common, but if you're going to go to some other place, or maybe it is common depending on where you're coming from, but if you go someplace else, it might be more common. So we're going to talk a little bit about the realities of how this shows up in a lot of different countries and cultures, what to do about it if you encounter it, how it works for people who want to take advantage of it and things like this, and I think a very basic lesson that is important for everyone when they're moving abroad to consider. And this goes for no matter where you go. If you're going to Denmark, this is going to apply. If you're going to Germany, it applies. If you're going to Ukraine, it applies. If you're going to Africa, it applies. Everywhere, this lesson is going to apply. So we're going to dive into that. Before we do, if you haven't been here already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell. Really appreciate your support. Check out our videos. We try to produce great content for you every day. And if you like the video, give us a thumbs up. If you don't, please tell me why in the comments below. Here we help you with international corporate structuring, so how to set up the best legal structure, where to go if you want to relocate, figuring out the strategy as well as the implementation, forming companies, opening bank accounts, getting residencies, getting citizenships, getting payment processing, etc., etc. If you have any interest in that, you'd like some help, please reach out to me. You can book a call at clarity.fm/Michael Rosmer. There's a link in the description below. Or you can check out our websites, offshorecitizen.net, offshorecapitalist.com, and you can send us a message there. Okay, let's dive in. So certainly, I'm from Canada originally, and in Canada, bribery is not a normal thing, right? What do I mean by that? If you get pulled over by the police, they're not going to ask you for a bribe. I've never heard of this happening in Canada. It's possible that it's happened, now and then, but I've never heard of this happening. By contrast, I've been living for a while in Bulgaria, and I know a lot of people who have been pulled over and the police have asked them for money, right? And so the question is, you're in a different culture, how do you deal with that? What's going on there? Is this a unique thing to these countries? How does it show up? And just what to do with that. Before I go into that, I'd love to hear from you guys if you have any experience having somebody hit you up for a bribe, how you dealt with it, what you've seen, what you've experienced, where it was, etc. Because certainly in some parts of the world this is normal, commonplace. In other parts of the world, this is not so commonplace, at least at the low level. So love to hear it in the comments. Now, before I go into that though, the one thing I do want to point out is, there's this talk of corruption in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, in Africa, etc. And you can look at a country like Denmark, for instance, which is considered to be the least corrupt country in the world. And I talked to friends from Denmark, and they're like, that's not true. It's just that corruption happens at the high levels rather than at the base levels, right? So, the truth is politicians will sell some company to the private sector. They'll privatize this business at some discount to some other big company that's going to take a huge win off of it, just like anywhere else. So corruption exists everywhere, right? Whether it's blatant bribery, whether it's, some sort of favor or something, politicians around the world, they get caught for it. It's going on that they don't get caught for it. Corruption is a way of life, right? We're going to talk about that in a minute. The difference, I think, is it down at this base level, right? Will you see it at the police station? Now, generally speaking, I think corruption and bribery is an unfortunate bad thing, right? It tends not to be good for a country, in part because it increases the uncertainty of doing business, in part because it's a symptom of a bunch of other dysfunctions, and in part because of the fact that it's basically pulling value away from where value could better be allocated, right? I have I have some people who I was talking to a while ago who were telling an interesting story about how things are changing, fortunately, in some parts of the world. And this was a story specifically to do with Bulgaria. The person had said they'd been away. They were actually a native of Bulgaria, but they'd lived abroad for like 20 years. And they came back and they had this thought that, oh yeah, Bulgaria, it's corrupt, there's bribery and stuff. And they ended up getting pulled over by the police, and they said, the person came up and it's like, oh, you were speeding. And they're like, oh yeah. So how do you want to take care of this? What do you need here? And the guy was like, excuse me? Are you trying to bribe me? And he was like, what? No. So, certainly there's an evolution that is taking place in a bunch of places, partially driven by, certain forces that are putting pressure on regimes, partially, I think, kind of grassroots. Georgia has done a great job of going after the corruption in the last period of time. There's some other examples as well. And so I think that's generally a better thing. It's generally not good to have police come and shake you down, right? But that being said, if you were in that situation, what would you do? So I think some of the best advice was given to me when I came to Eastern Europe for, not the first time, but one of the first times, that the person who had lived there for many, many years told me, it was like, hey, I just play dumb. I'm just like, oh, sorry, I can't understand. I don't speak your language, which happened to be true. And the whole point is this. If you're in a situation where somebody is hitting you up for money based on kind of intimidation, very often the tendency, if you're ignorant of it, is to be afraid. But very often there's no need to be afraid, right? It's kind of a thing that's going on. I've had some people tell me, it's like, oh yeah, crying helps. So that's one thing, right? It's just to know that if there's nothing really going wrong, then it's great. And if you just kind of push back against it a little bit, if you roll over, they're going to take whatever from you. If you don't, often they're going to be like, okay, just go. Or maybe they'll write you a ticket, which is a pittance compared to what actually would happen there. Now, obviously, there's some cultural awareness, and there's some situational awareness there of what's your real situation, right? I have a friend who was telling me a story about going into Venezuela, and that's quite a different situation, right? That reminds me a little bit of something similar, kind of the underlying driver, which is I was in Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago and was talking to an Uber driver, and he was explaining to me, he's like, look, I'm from Africa, and in Africa, people are making $200 a month in a government job. If they don't ask for bribes, they can't eat. They can't afford it. That's just what it is that they're earning, and they can't get by on it. So the corruption, the bribery, etc., is a function of a dysfunctional system. It's, an unfortunate side effect. And so you can kind of appreciate that. I've heard many stories about this with respect to doctors, right? Doctors who, in some parts of Eastern Europe, they're paid $600 a month, which, me coming from Canada, where doctors are some of the highest paid professions in the country, I was like, what? Are you kidding me? Aren't your doctors paid, better than a lot of people? No, it turns out, compared to IT people, they're very underpaid, as an example. So, when you're in that situation and the doctor wants, some of these doctors will be flagrant about, great, leave the tip on the table. You need to tip properly. And, that's just a function of, okay, getting good service. And maybe you have to do that even though it's not normal in your part of the world, right? In this story of the guy who was going into Venezuela, he said he had to pass through these multiple checkpoints where each time they would try and hit him up. And I think this brings kind of the next lesson. So the first one is, hey, listen, have situational awareness, realize that you can play dumb, you can push back. You typically don't have to actually give them what it is that they're asking for. If you're in a terrible situation where, I don't know, you were seriously breaking the law, maybe you're doing drugs in Thailand or something, and they take that very seriously, that might be a problem. But if you're, just carrying out normal life, right, then that shouldn't be an issue. Now, in his case, he said what happened was at each checkpoint, they would want to hit him up. And so he would negotiate with them, right? He would say, hey, listen, it's not reasonable to take all of my money. What am I going to do here? And so that's the other thing, right, is that if you're in a situation where, hey, listen, it's funny to me because in Western culture, there's some laws in some countries that, hey, listen, big companies aren't allowed to be involved in bribery and corruption and things like this. It's you kind of have to understand, that's the way that things are in these places, right? Some of these places, to get things done, to make things happen, it's fee for service, really. And, if you're not going to deal with that, well, you're not going to get very far, right? So, in this particular case, all he was doing was just trying to travel into Venezuela to go and check it out. But that is a negotiable process, right? It's not like this is static. And this is, I think, again, just a general lesson of much of the world relative to the Western world, right? So if you're in Western Europe, if you're in Canada, if you're in the US, these are not barter cultures, right? We're not really used to going to the grocery store and negotiating, although you actually can in some particular situations, but that's another matter. You're in a situation where you're used to just the price is the price, right? And some people actually are offended and they really dislike it. But the reality is, if you're in that culture, you have to negotiate, and negotiation is just such a valuable skill. So that's kind of the next piece. The last part, I think, is concerning, the reality of how these things happen in a lot of places. A lot of people, I think, who have never experienced some country think, oh, hey, I can just, this is a corrupt country. I can come in and just pay somebody and get what I want. And that's rarely true in what it is that I've seen. What I've seen is that what happens is largely a function, when you're talking about kind of like extra special treatment, is more a function of relationships. And this comes back to a key lesson that I have kind of reiterated a bunch of times on many of our videos, is the importance of building quality relationships. This is not just in any other country. This could be in your home country, right? I can give you a simple example. My hairdresser. I had a great relationship with my hairdresser. The last time I was went to see him, I'd come into town briefly, and I had called the hair studio, and he'd been traveling or something and wasn't available. And anyway, so I had to postpone and book for however many days later. But I remember coming in and saying to him, like, hey, I'd called in, and this. He was like, oh, next time just text me, and I'll get you in. And it's like, what's that a function of? That's a function of the fact that I have a relationship with him, right? Like, I'm not just a customer to him. We go out and we go to a birthday party together, or we, things like this. I've seen that I have a very good friend who's a chiropractor, fantastic guy, fantastic chiropractor. And, again, you have whatever's booked. And, I remember there was kind of this joke at his office. It was like, Michael, do you want me to book you in? I was like, sure, you can book me in for the same time I always am booked in for. It's like, when's that? It's like, well, I'll just walk in and, he will fit me in to his schedule, and that'll work out. That's great. Like, that's a certain privilege that comes from having built a good quality relationship with somebody who is going to care for you. And that's great. So I think my basic piece of advice to people, and no matter where you go in the world, including being in your home place, is just the value of quality relationships, right? Most people stay within a certain social circle. They are quite rigid. They tend to have fairly superficial relationships, right? It is worth it to go that extra mile in order to build quality. I remember I used to go shopping and get these good cookies. There were these healthy cookies before I would go to see my naturopath. And, I'd bring cookies to my naturopath. Not for any reason other than the fact that, well, first of all, I was buying them and they were tasty. But, it was just part of this, like, enjoyment of the social whatever. And as a result, you build a deeper relationship than a normal customer. And that has like this significant long-term payoff. Whether you're talking about at restaurants. I had a restaurant that I used to go to, and I would always go for the same waiter. Basically my thing, Wallace was his name, and I would go in and I'd say, is Wallace working? And it'd be like, no, then I just wouldn't go. And if it was, I would specifically request Wallace, and I was probably Wallace's best customer. I probably brought 200 people into them during that time. As a result, there was things that would happen, and it would be like, Michael's a very good customer, so we're going to accommodate accordingly. And yeah, I just think that's like, it's like this huge life hack that's highly underrated, and it will just carry you so far. So anyway, I hope that helps. I hope that's interesting to you. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends. If you don't, tell me why in the comments. Click the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, check out our other videos. And yeah, if you'd like help with international structuring, international living, where best to go, how to get set up, help with getting set up, reach out to me, clarity.fm/Michael Rosmer, link in the description below. And we will talk to you guys on the next video.